The first of our three resolutions deals with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has some tough critics here in the U.S., including among members of Congress from both parties, but a more forgiving perspective comes from President Trump himself, who appears more likely to excuse than to criticize some of the excesses of the kingdom, and who told his controversial prince, Mohammed bin Salman, according to the New York Times, "You're doing a terrific job." So given that, our first resolution is this: Trump is right on Saudi Arabia. Our first speaker on this resolution will be Michael Doran. The resolution, Trump is right on Saudi Arabia. Michael, how do you declare, yes or no?
Yes.
And you have 90 seconds.
Emphatically
the floor is
so.
yours.
Thank you. The president is right on Saudi Arabia because he understands that we've had two elections from two different parties, two presidential elections, that have elected candidates who said the United States is going to pull back from the Middle East. First, that was Barack Obama, and then that was Donald Trump. He understands that the American public is not willing to have another George W. Bush-style intervention in the Middle East. And yet he also knows, as I think does our entire national security elite, that we can't just leave the Middle East and leave it to its own devices. That's the legacy, that's the lesson of the Obama administration's foreign policy. President Obama tried to pull back. The last thing he wanted to do was to go back in Iraq and to get involved in Syria, but he had to, because we have to have order in the Middle East. And if the United States is going to make order in the Middle East, and it's not going to do it itself, then it has to have friends, and it has to work with allies. And the number of allies who can work to create a regional order is actually very small. The number of candidates who can project power beyond their borders. There are only three, and they are Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. That's it. There's no other choice. If we're not going to do it ourselves, we have to do it with friends. There's no other possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Doran. We move on to our next debater on the same question. Trump is right on Saudi Arabia. Barbara Slavin, how do you declare, yes or no?
No. I'm surprised you didn't mention the United Arab Emirates, but anyway. No, the Trump administration has squandered its leverage in the Middle East by blindly supporting the Saudi monarchy, and in particular, its reckless and cruel crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. There was no good reason for Trump to go to Saudi Arabia as his first foreign trip. He could have gone to a Democratic ally of the United States. His bet appeared to be that the Saudis would be so bowled over by this presidential attention that they would forge an overt alliance with Israel and spend billions more dollars on US weaponry. While the Saudis have drawn somewhat closer to the Israelis, they have not supported Trump's unilateral moves like moving our embassy to Jerusalem or recognizing the Golan Heights, and they haven't bought much additional US hardware. Meanwhile, Mohammed bin Salman, who's known as MBS, has made a series of disastrous decisions, including boycotting Qatar, holding the Prime Minister of Lebanon and nearly 400 Saudi businessmen hostage, waging a brutal war in Yemen, and last but very much not least, murdering the journalist Jamal Khashoggi a year ago. Had the US taken a different tack, we would have had much more leverage with the Saudis, and it's possible that MBS would not have become crown prince.
Thank you, Barbara Slavin. Brett McGurk, you're next in line on the resolution Trump is right on Saudi Arabia. Are you yes or no?
I'm a no, John. Take Trump out of the question. We're here on the Upper West Side. I can imagine what most of the audience thinks. But take Trump out of the question. What do we want from Saudi Arabia? We want a moderate Saudi Arabia. We want a successful Saudi Arabia. We want a Saudi Arabia that is working for stability in the region. Trump has given Saudi Arabia unconditional love. And there should be no unconditional love in the Middle East. We had no ambassador for 2 years. We had no engagement from the Secretary of State because Trump went around the Secretary of State. And look at the results. Saudi Arabia today is weaker, more isolated in the region and in Washington, and facing increasing problems. On Trump's watch, and I agree with Michael, we need a united front in the region. On Trump's watch, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, 6 countries in the Gulf, has split because the Saudis have led a boycott of Qatar. That has weakened our ability to deal with problems in the region and Iran. Saudi Arabia on Trump's watch has escalated the war in Yemen, and we've basically abandoned diplomacy in Yemen to try to de-escalate that humanitarian catastrophe. On Trump's watch, bipartisan majorities in Congress, which are rare these days, have rebuked Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is now becoming a partisan issue in Washington, which is not good for us and not good for Saudi Arabia. Defense spending in Saudi Arabia, they spend 11% of their GDP on defense. They spend more than Russia on defense, and yet they are in desperate need of domestic reforms because they have an economic crisis, and we are not working with them at all on these critical questions. So I speak as a friend of Saudi Arabia, and the record, I think, speaks for itself. Trump has not been good for Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Brett McGurk. Reuel, Marc, Gerecht, Trump is right on Saudi Arabia, yes or no?
Hey.
No. I mean, I have to say this is an odd occasion. I'm in agreement with Barbara Slavin, sort of.
The foundation for defensive democracy.
I tell you.
God.
I mean, I'm going to define this fairly narrowly. You know, I think President Trump has some flexibility in his definitions, so I'm going to utilize the same flexibility. If you look at Saudi Arabia, is it really an ally of the United States in the sense that can it allow the United States to diminish its footprint in the region? And can it help build an alliance against the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the most convulsive and lethal force in the region? And I think the answer there has to be no. I mean, the Saudis are incapable of using ground troops in any meaningful sense. In Syria, the Iranians, the Russians, and the Assad regime have slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Sunnis, and the Saudis were able to do nothing. Saudi Air Force has some power, but let's be honest, if the Americans aren't there lending a hand, they can't really do anything. You don't trust them. I think that has come clear in the Yemen war. There's a good reason for the Saudis to be fighting in Yemen. However, I would disagree in the way that they have done it. I don't think it's been terribly productive. And again, it's largely because the MBS in particular goes his own way and he's not reliable. And I would say, I mean, just take, for example, the murder of Khashoggi. I think it's fair to say that was a botched effort.
Well, I'm sorry, your time is up, but you can continue your thoughts.
I would just say the Iranians do a vastly better job. I mean, you cannot, the Saudis cannot actually kill someone competently.
Okay.
Don't trust them.
Okay.
It's an odd way to put it.
Trump is right on Saudi Arabia. Bernard Haykel, are you yes or no?
I'm a yes. I'm with Michael on this one. I think that Trump has basically seen the lie of the land in the Middle East, and he's seen in Saudi Arabia a regime that is willing to do certain things that are profoundly in America's interests. The first of which is the complete cessation of all funding to Islamists and to Muslim political radicals throughout not just the region, but the entire world. Saudi Arabia now is in a transition away from Islam being a fundamental core element of its identity towards a country that is more like a normal country where nationalism is central to the identity of the country. The second thing that this regime is doing in Saudi Arabia is that it is trying to change and modernize its society by clamping down on reactionary Islamists domestically. It has given greater rights to women, something that was thought impossible before the present regime in Saudi Arabia. Women are now in the public arena, they're in the workforce, they're driving, and this seems to me to be a momentum that cannot be stopped. So on a number of issues, Trump has been right to support this regime. Now, this regime has also made terrible blunders in Saudi Arabia. The killing of Jamal is only one. The war in Yemen is the other. But you can't, pick and choose your allies, and we are stuck with Saudi Arabia, and we want it to move in the right direction.
Thank you, Bernard Haykel. And that concludes the opening round. And now we have a more freewheeling conversation, but what we have are, on the resolution, Trump is right on Saudi Arabia, 3 noes and 2 yeses. The noes have described Trump's position on Saudi Arabia as unconditional love and as blind support, as reckless and naive. They're basically arguing that Saudi Arabia does more harm than good for U.S. interests, that it's an unreliable ally, a weaker ally than before, and that bottom line, cozying up is not bringing about an improvement of the position of U.S. interests. The two debaters on the other side make a very strong argument. Number one, we need the ally. Saudi Arabia has been an ally. Saudi Arabia will do things that we want Saudi Arabia to do. Some of them might not be very pleasant, but we want them to do it. And that Saudi Arabia is changing, is trying to change and becoming less perhaps offensive culturally and politically than it has been in the past. So we have a lot to dig in there. I want to start with you, Barbara Slavin. The position that your argument, some of your now at this point opponents are taking, that at bottom, Saudi Arabia does deliver, that if we need an ally out there to do stuff, give us places to base our planes, for example, spend money in areas we want it spent, for example, that Saudi Arabia does it and that nobody else is going to do it, and that's the key of the argument for why it's a good thing to keep Saudi Arabia in our corner.
Yeah, well, look, I'm not arguing that we should cut relations with Saudi Arabia. I just think we need more balance in our relations with various countries in the region. And I think that embracing this blind anti-Iran position was a particular mistake, and I know we're going to get to that. But there are other places. I mean, we have the United Arab Emirates, we have Qatar, we have our biggest air base in Qatar, so we don't really need Saudi Arabia for that. I support the idea that the Saudis are trying to reform, but you know, they've got most of the advocates of reform in prison, including a number of women who, you know, wanted the right to drive, and so they have the right to drive, but instead these women are in jail. I just think MBS is...
Why does that matter to U.S. interests?
Because I think MBS has shown that he has terrible judgment, that he's reckless and cruel, and he is not somebody that we should put a lot of faith in. I think we have to be very, very careful and not put all our eggs in his basket.
Michael Doran, to respond?
Look, there are realities of power in the world, and there's realities of power in the Middle East. We are not going to remake this region into an image, into our own image. We're not going to coerce these people through military force, and we're not going to entice them to be like us. We have interests. We have to focus on those interests, and we have to think about who are the most influential actors that can help us. The problem we have in the region now is the rise of Iran. Iran is spreading its influence all over the region through proxies. It's delivering to them precision weapons. They're threatening all of our allies, and especially Israel. And Saudi Arabia sees the region exactly as Israel does. And it's using its resources and its influence, which is considerable, in oil markets, in Europe, in Washington even, to project a picture of the region and our interests and their interests that is identical to Israel's interests.
Barbara,
I'm sorry, but you know, the war in Yemen has been a gift to Iran. Every stupid thing MBS does is a gift to Iran. He is not a reliable ally for the United States.
Look, I've worked with MBS, and he actually is someone who you can reason with. If you simply give him unconditional support, as Trump has done, again, no ambassador in Riyadh. I worked for 2 years in the Trump administration. There's no ambassador there for 2 years. We had no very senior level engagement because everything was going around the entire national security team who actually knows something about the region. But I keep hearing Trump sees this, he sees this. Trump doesn't see anything. There's no strategy behind this. Trump is being described, he's being described as a close friend of Saudi Arabia. This is a man who has said repeatedly that King Salman, the custodian of the two holiest mosques of Islam, a very important figure, would be gone in 2 weeks without our military support. That's what Trump says to him. He embarrasses them. He diminishes them. He brings MBS in the Oval Office with posters of ships and boats. As a senior Middle East leader said to me, it looks like you've been bought. He is not benefiting Saudi Arabia. And I speak again as a friend of Saudi Arabia. I agree with the moderate reforms. That has to happen. We're not helping. We're making it worse.
Bernard Haykel.
I mean, I think that there are a couple of assumptions that have been made here. One is that somehow if Trump wouldn't support the regime, then someone else could have come into power. MBS could have been replaced by the United States. I think that's hogwash. We cannot interfere in the internal workings of another country like Saudi Arabia. It's a very opaque place, and the royal family has total dominance and control over the society. And MBS is in charge. Now, if we want to start meddling there in a way like I suspect Barbara would like us to do, we could have a civil war in that country. A civil war in a country that produces over 10 million barrels of oil a day. A country that when we tell it, you need to produce more because there's been a cutoff or shutoff of oil either in Libya or Venezuela or wherever, they will do it. They are an ally of the United States. They're not perfect, far from it. They have lots of warts, and we should put pressure on them to fix those warts. But to pressurize them to behave in exactly the way that we want them to behave is not going to work.
But the question is whether Trump...
I want to bring in
Trump is having a good
wait,
policy.
folks, we haven't heard from Reuel yet. I want to give him a chance to get into the conversation, then I'll come to you as well. But so just bouncing off of what Bernard was saying, that we shouldn't meddle, can't meddle, are you actually arguing in your no position for wanting to change and shape what Saudi Arabia is?
Not really. I mean, I think the primary thing you always have to be concerned with Middle Eastern societies, particularly a traditional one like Saudi Arabia going into transition, is its fragility. So I think the primary American objective with Saudi Arabia is do less. I think it should be, we should want them to do less outside of Saudi Arabia, and we should probably want them to do less inside of Saudi Arabia. I'm not a terribly big fan of the argument that says we want authoritarian leaders to coerce their societies into progress. I think modern Middle Eastern history tells you just the opposite, that these progressive leaders, the ones that are usually embraced by the West, end up uprooting traditional society and actually bringing on that which we wanted them to actually stop. It makes the situation worse. It makes it into a pre-revolutionary situation. So I think the United States wants evolution in Saudi Arabia. All societies evolve, but you would want to do it conservatively, and you do not want to see the Saudis, particularly MBS, start trying to throw its muscle around the region because it's just going to muck it up.
Brett, you wanted to jump in a moment ago.
Well, the war in Yemen was mentioned, but even on the war in Yemen, and I agree with the Iranians are doing it in Yemen is terrible. But on Trump's watch, the UAE, the only real ally with Saudi Arabia in Yemen, is leaving. So the whole record here, I think, speaks for itself. It just has not been beneficial to Saudi Arabia or to our interests.
Just one point on the Crown Prince. Sure. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, developed a relationship with MBS before he was Crown Prince, and he pushed him and pushed him. And I'm sure that had some influence in Riyadh, because there were others who could have been named Crown Prince, if not for the mucking around of the Trump administration and Trump's son-in-law.
So I don't agree with that. I agree
I
with
want
you that we should.
I want to give Michael a
I want
shot.
to make 2 points. One is this. Since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, everyone in America knows his name. We've got in China.
They don't pronounce it
We've
correctly,
got in China. We've got in China 1 million people in concentration camps. There hasn't been as much attention on that as there's been on Jamal Khashoggi.
That's true.
Why? Why? It's not because of Saudi Arabia. It's not because of MBS. It's because of the relationship between Jared Kushner and MBS. It's all about, it's an indirect way of going after Trump.
No.
We have become an incredibly parochial country where our domestic debate, we now talk about foreign policy to score points in our domestic debate. This is not the way to run a good foreign policy. One last point,
Okay,
quickly,
sure.
very quickly.
Yeah.
The Yemen war, we had a great deal with Saudi Arabia for many, many years, 75 years. They bought our arms and they didn't use them. Right? And then the deal was we took care of the region around. And under Barack Obama, we said to them, we don't do that anymore. The Iranians are moving into Yemen, your problem, not ours. The Iranians are building a Hezbollah in Yemen with precision weapons that can hit Riyadh, a G20 capital, which as Bernard said, has some of the largest reserves in the world. And what did we do about that? Nothing.
Okay, Michael, Barbara, you're in.
Yeah, look, I don't see it in domestic political terms. Jamal Khashoggi was lured into his own consulate in Istanbul and butchered. I'm sorry. I think that's, whatever the Chinese may do, they have their own human rights abuses, but this was appalling. He was someone who lived in the United States, who was a peaceful advocate of change in his own society, and there has been no accountability for that action.
The Iranians and Hezbollah, the Iranians and Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies have uprooted 10 million people in Syria. They have killed 500,000 people in Syria. Every one of them has a name.
Yeah, well, I would put that on the Assad.
I want to ask Brett McGurk a question, and then I would like Bernard to respond to the answer that Brett gives. But Brett, you talked about unconditional love is problematic. I don't mean this to be sarcastic, but what level of love should we be showing for Saudi Arabia? To what end?
Could you draw pictures?
The thing is, not only unconditional, it's also abusive, because I mentioned what President Trump has said about King Salman. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Look, Saudi Arabia is a critical ally of ours. We have to engage with them. I've spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. But what happened in the first years of the Trump administration was just a total green light, and you saw all sorts of reckless behavior, which has damaged our interests. Our allies in the region now are divided. The UAE, a critical ally of ours, is leaving Yemen. Donald Trump, you might think, wants to be more present in the Middle East to correct for some of the mistakes of the Obama administration, but he says publicly, why are our ships there? What are we doing there? There is no confidence in the region that Donald Trump wants to be engaged in the region. So it has to be a level of engagement with a very close partner of the United States who shares interests with ours, but also has a lot of differences with ours. But when you're not engaged, when you don't have an ambassador, when your Secretary of State is cut out of the loop, you end up seeing reckless behavior. It creates a classic moral hazard.
So the solution is what?
The solution is to have, we finally have a strong ambassador in Saudi Arabia. You're engaged.
In order to be telling him, the Saudis, what to do?
Yes, you have to be regularly engaged and say this. If you do this, that would be very bad.
Bernard? And then
I totally agree. I think that the relationship with the United States and Saudi Arabia, this highly personalized form of the relationship, is not helpful to either side. We have to build institutional links like we used to once have between the intelligence services and so on, but also to explain to Saudi Arabia that if you're going to be an ally, that establishes certain limits.
So are you on the other? Are you now arguing the other side?
No. I'm not arguing on the other side. Okay. I think that you have to give Saudi Arabia support for all the good things that it's doing, and then you have to tell them discreetly that certain things that they're doing are wrong, and they shouldn't do that.
Well.
The primary problem is that President Trump is continuing the policy of President Obama, and that is the disengagement of the United States from the Middle East, the retreat of the United States from the Middle East. When the United States retreats from the Middle East, guess what? Other people are going to go in the vacuum, in this case MBS, and MBS simply can't handle it. Saudi Arabia as a society can't handle it. So you want more of America, less of Saudi Arabia.
We have 1 minute left. We have two speakers I'd like to have a last word, Michael and Barbara. Michael, can you take it first? And really try to keep it to 30 seconds. I'll stop you at 30.
We have to start from the assumption that we're not going to do more. This is the point. We're not going to do more, and we have to work with the powers that exist, the powers that are comfortable with the American, with the American order. There is a country in the region, Iran, that is trying to overturn the American order, and it's supported by Russia. We have to look at the region in a very clear-eyed fashion and work with those people that want to keep the American order and keep stability, fight terrorism, and keep the problems of the Middle East in the Middle East and not elsewhere.
Barbara Slavin.
Yeah, the Iranians are an opportunistic power, and they are profiting from the numerous mistakes made by the United States and its allies in the region. Mike, you served in the Bush administration. The invasion of Iraq was the main reason why Iran has more influence in the region.
Brett worked on it, right? Not me.
I don't think it's fair to bring Syria into this. What's happened in Syria is terrible. But let me just say that MBS, it's not just Khashoggi. 64 of the Saudis detained in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, their whereabouts are unknown. 30 others have been forcibly disappeared. Lujain al-Hathlul, one of the champions of women driving, has been rotting in prison, tortured. We have influence in Saudi Arabia. We don't have influence with Assad. We should be doing something about that.
Thank you. That concludes our debate on resolution number 1, Trump is right on Saudi Arabia.